This is going to be the last class right before our final exam, and so of this semester as well. So we are going to do some sort of a wrap up towards the end of the class to just see where everyone's at and also to better understand or reflect on our learning altogether. So with that said, we are going to move forward with our next slide, which is about AI mediated speaking interaction. So when we talk about, hold on, okay. So when we start talking about AI mediated speaking interaction, so first of all, it involves learners engaging in spoken communication with conversational agents and also AI speaking partners. I think we slightly talked about how AI speaking platforms work last class. And in those instances, what people would do is that they would be able to talk using their speaking skills or developing it with an AI conversational agent. Usually throughout the semester, we have observed about communicative competence, right? And also interactional competence. If you can remember, we talked about discourse, we talked about repair, and I think corrective feedback was another one that was related to speaking skills. And one of the most interesting questions today that we can ask is whether AI can support these aspects of language learning, including the things that we have talked about. So traditionally, speaking practices required things like teachers. It also needed classmates, peers, also tutors sometimes, and people also studied a lot of the immersion language learning settings, including study abroad experiences or like things like English camps. However, nowadays, learners can engage in spoken interaction with AI systems using tools such as ChatGPT. I think there's Elsa Speak and other conversational agents available as well. So researchers have found that many learners report some sort of a lower anxiety, the foreign language anxiety that we talked about when speaking with AI. And we might try to explain what might be the potential reasons. Why do you think learners would feel a bit lower anxiety level when they're communicating with an AI speaking agent? What might be potential explanations that we can assume at this point? Anyone? So some learners have reported that they feel less anxious in talking to AI compared to when they're talking to another human being. What might be the reasons that could trigger learners' lower anxiety level in communication with an AI?
Um,
Yeah.
because we all know that AI agents are always supportive
Mhm.
and never say bad words to us.
So I think we just pointed out something that we talked about last time regarding how some platforms are very agreeable to the speaker, right? So they seem to be very supportive. They never criticize unless you tell them to. So in those cases, I think people might feel more comfortable to talk with an AI compared to a human being. But at the same time, what we can think about is that sometimes human beings judge, right, other person depending on how that person talks or behaves. And AI probably does not really judge you in the same way that the human beings does. And also the relationship that you have between you and another human being might last longer compared to an AI, which eventually, if you think the conversation is not going that well and it becomes sour, then you can just delete the conversation, right? And just ignore that it ever happened. However, you can't really delete the memory that you have built with another human being, right? You can't just go to that person and say like red sun and suddenly like everything goes away. That's not really possible. So I think that's one of the reasons why people might feel a little bit more comfortable to talk with an AI compared to a human being. However, we should always ask the questions like things like, is speaking with AI really the same speaking with, I mean, same as speaking with another human being, right? Is it really a conversation that we would imagine that would occur between human to human? And other questions that we can ask are things like, as this slide mentions, things like, can AI truly negotiate meaning? Right? If it's just agreeing to another person, we would not necessarily call it a conversation, right? Because you need to have those tension or that challenge that arise from the conversation. Through that, we can experience negotiation, true meaning negotiation. And another one is like, can AI really understand the emotions that we feel, right? And other questions would include things like, can AI participate in authentic social relationship building? So these might be some of the questions that remain still active in the areas of research too. But I just wanted to quickly ask you guys, what do you think? What do you think could be something AI can offer in terms of speaking interaction? And what do you think might be the biggest challenge that AI holds? Aside from what we just talked about, or in addition to what we talked about in more depth. Any thoughts? Anel, you look very serious today. You're like frowning. Deep in thought?
I don't know, like about the benefits, like the biggest benefit of AI, maybe it has like perfect grammar,
Mm-hmm.
perfect, I don't know, like academic speech, so you can learn from it.
Mm-hmm.
Other than that, I don't know.
Yeah, other than that, you don't know. Regarding grammar too, sometimes AI do also make mistakes. I've noticed. Like, have you ever experienced where you criticize, like, I don't think this is the right word or this is suitable for this particular genre, then they go like, oh, I'm sorry. Like, they're very quick in apologizing their mistakes. But
Yeah.
overall, compared to the frequency that human beings make in terms of grammar, I agree that AI could be more accurate in terms of the grammatical skills. Yes. But anything else that we should consider when we are talking, I mean, when we are speaking? I mean, we said during our semester that grammar is a very important part in our speech because if grammar is not there, our output is just going to be nonsense, right? But what do you think might be some of the other characteristics or some like let's try to think about the future direction. Okay, so what could be the challenge that it faces nowadays and how you think that that could be solved in the future?
I
Jiangsu?
think
Yeah.
I think one of the difference that we actually communicate with human beings and speaking with AI is that AI is only communicate us through like chats or voices,
Mm.
but in real life we during our conversation we have like body gestures or facial expressions. So I think that's the key difference of nowadays AI conversation and human beings. So it might be one of the aspects that the uh, future AI should have or overcome.
That's actually a very important point, and that's something that I am currently working on. So when Chongsu just said that, I was like, oh, we have been starting to talk about something called multimodal language assessment. So as Chongsu just mentioned, in real talk, we use a lot of multimodality. We talked about how language is not just the only mode that we use in conversation. We use emoticons in written, or you guys can use a lot of pictures, for example, to describe what's going on. You know how I use this slide in my social linguistics class, but the number of like when you say yes in Korean, we use ne, right? Or or a lot of different variety. But I heard that depending on the repetition of how many nep you have, like one nep and two nep and three nep, like or like the number of the periods that you have, like all these people would interpret attaching meanings to it differently. So what Chongsu just mentioned, in real speech, we might use body gestures, we could use different tones, but those might be missed, or we can use our eye contact or different gestures. All those would be included in, should be included in understanding one's speech more comprehensively. So I think, but the difficulty that we currently have with the development of technology nowadays is, I think the only access that we currently have is like the eye tracking machine. But other than that, it's a very difficult concept, but it's a very important one. Another difficulty related to that multimodality has to do with the meaning of gestures is very cultural. Right. So it's arbitrary as well. We might say that in this class, we are going to use this gestures when we are happy. And it's something that we all agree on. It's something that we share it all together, but it might be understood differently depending on content and also culture. So I think that's a very important point too. Not just because I'm interested in it, but I think it's an important one. Any other comments related to that or? But speaking platforms, I think they do carry a lot of potential. And I think talking about multimodality, I think that's something that we can observe in speaking much more than written. So, and it's going to be something that is very interesting, I believe. So let's see how that develops. But I think this is another area where we can start thinking about related to the AI speaking interaction that's going to be introduced to us in the future. But in addition to that, in AI speaking, not only in speaking, but also in written forms, we are going to come back to this notions of corrective feedback that we talked about in class. So this slide should sound somewhat familiar because we spent last week discussing corrective feedback and also uptake. And we're going to look at that in AI interaction more specifically. So AI systems can provide many of the same feedback types that we discussed so far. Things like direct correction or implicit forms such as recast, clarification request, or meta-linguistic feedback. All those would be possible. But AI further introduces new possibilities. For example, the feedback can be very instant. Right. So for in a language classroom, when there are, let's say, 30 students and one teacher, then sometimes the feedback, there might be feedback delay that the instructor would not be able to provide instant feedback, or even the provision, like providing the offer of the feedback or the type of feedback could be personalized. We talked about this sometimes before, but the AI can analyze what kind of feedback works best for this particular individual learner and provide like a tailor-made, personalized feedback for that particular student. And not only that, I think one of the strengths that AI has currently is that it can be used or it is available 24/7. But again, I always wonder, do students really want to learn language 24/7, like in the middle of the night, suddenly waking up and say like, oh, I think I'm just going to spend some time learning Japanese. I don't know, but I think still that a feature is offered as one of the strengths of the AI systems. However, more feedback is not always better. That's another thing that we talked about in this semester, right? Imagine an AI that corrects every single error that you'd make, right? So you might want to balance that out, and we have to consider, would that in fact help learning, or would it in fact interrupt the conversational flow if it's a spoken discourse? And further on, the feedback timing, the personalization, and the conversational flow, how that influence learner motivation and anxiety is something that we can start talking about and also research on. So researchers increasingly examine the balance between accuracy. Also, they look at fluency, they look at learner confidence, and most of all, they look at also how the AI could affect these elements in language learning. So this connects directly to one of the major themes of second language acquisition, which has to do with um, the two different views, which has to do with successful communication versus grammatical accuracy. So we are looking into either two. So another strength I believe that an AI holds is this idea of inclusivity and interaction. These are some of the topics that are becoming very important in CAL research, the computer assisted language learning research, which is first of all, inclusivity. So the thing is technology. Oh, before we begin, let me just ask you a question. Do you think technology is neutral? Do you think technology is presented as neutral? We just immediately said no. Do you want to talk a bit more about why you think it's not neutral, or?
Um, Whenever I take any class related to technology, even in this class, uh, professors often say technology is never considered neutral. I just educated.
Oh, that's not good. That's like drilling. It's like you have been drilled, or you have been yeah, I mean, the good word is educate. A nicer way to say it is educated, but it feels like, yeah. Anyways, but any other thoughts related to why you think it's not neutral?
Um,
I mean,
Maybe,
you can hold different views. It's completely
yeah,
fine. Yeah.
but it makes sense that as scientists or as engineers, we have to have at least some degree of ethical concerns or responsibilities. Yeah, yeah. I think it makes sense.
Because professors have said it several times, and not only one professor, but several professors have said it. Okay, that's a good reason. Okay, so I think when AI came out, a lot of people have started talking about bias it had, right? And one of the reason was because they are trained. I mean, not trained by language data that people use, but then the people use language in a very, we talked about stereotypes in this class before, right? So people use language very differently. It's not a neutral language. It's filled with emotion, it's filled with bias, it's filled with stereotypes, anger, love, everything is in language. What that means is AI system that is trained based on that would carry on those ideas and ideologies. I think I talked about my former student who did research in the class where he studied, or he used AI to produce different images between intercultural marriage, I think it was international marriages, and put in different couples, like male from this background and female from this background. And it interestingly showed that the background and also the attire, the clothes that the characters were wearing, the couple was wearing, changed depending on the race. And I forgot the exact findings, but if it was like Caucasian Americans, then it had buildings in the background, and suddenly if it became like Asian, you suddenly have like fields in the back. So what that would the regarding that image might also suggest is that this preoccupied thoughts that we already have, like go would influence the production of the AI. I think last class was it Ui's group? Which group was it that talked about doctor, for example? When we talk about when we think about the word doctor, we immediately, a lot of the students would, or a lot of people would imagine a male doctor rather than a female doctor. So excuse me. So what we are trying to say is that technology is often presented as neutral. It is still presented on the cover, but technologies are most of all designed by people. We talked about who made these products before, right? And since it's designed by people, those people's thoughts and their beliefs, their ideologies would intervene in the establishment of these systems. So some of the decisions that people have to make is which language varieties are we going to include? Right? Which accents are we going to recognize, and whose communication styles are we going to treat as normal? But I have to say that this does not only apply to technology. This applies to every other educational materials that we have to come up with. Even the textbooks, we have to decide which countries to include and which countries do not. This is just off record too, but when we were creating the textbook for the first graders, I think 3 years ago, we initially started off the one chapter related to it was like a small region in Russia, I think. And that time there was this I think I forgot what it was exactly, but Korea was having some sort of a diplomatic tension, experiencing it with Russia at that time. So we decided to take that chapter out. You see what I'm saying? Like, and in English textbooks, you might have trouble finding Japan in it. And these are because the textbook makers and also the people who approve it are Koreans, right? So we want to make sure that a lot of these controversial items are not included. And for example, when we have the map of Korea, we have to make sure that Dokdo is included in it to make sure that it's there. Like, for example, all of these do come in even in the educational material. So I do not think that we are asking these questions only to technology, but to all the types of educational materials. And also, since with the emergence of technology and the development technology in the field of language education, that's why we are taking these questions more seriously than ever. I think that's one of the reasons why we are considering, is it really neutral? Is who have designed it, and what does this imply? So here in the last question, I have put down a short discussion question. Whose language practices do you think are legitimized in these AI systems? For example, if an AI system recognizes American English well, but struggles with Indian English or Korean English, what messages does that send to the users or the learners? So what do you guys think about this question?
I mean, probably the language that AI was trained in the most is the most legitimized, others to lesser extent. But I think that modern AIs are trained like in many languages. So
But so then my question is, which, let's say, where do these AI companies come from? Like, what I mean is, as Anel just mentioned about how it depends on the AI, right? What the AI is trained with. But at the same time, if, for example, if a lot of AI or 90% or 80% of the AI company, it comes from the States, then what? Or 80% of the companies now are in China. What would happen? Like, do you know where I'm going?
yeah, I understand, but I think that right now, no matter like the background of the developers, they still try to train AI on like tons and tons of data, just free access on the internet, so it can be proficient like in many languages.
In many languages,
Yeah,
yes.
but maybe like aside from language, maybe it will have some other bias, like a political or
Uh-huh,
cultural
uh-huh, uh-huh.
dimension.
Yes. So that's another problem related to that. But another one, I think you're absolutely right. The power of AI is in the data that it has, right? How much data that it holds. And I think another problem that people have pointed out was related to minority languages. So a lot of languages that are considered to be the major languages, yes, we have a lot of data to train with. However, a lot of disappearing languages, is there a way to save them from it's death. A lot of languages do die over time. I think you might have heard about this before or not, but that might be aggravate. The situation might even be get worse for those languages because they lack in terms of both data and the users of the language. So that's another problem related to that. Okay, good point. So the inclusivity means asking not just about does this technology work? It's more about for whom is it working? So for whom is this working and what does it imply? A lot of the ideas related to inclusivity has to do with the accents that we have. Are they trained with Korean English accents? I think we're going to soon talk about the accent diversity, so let's move on to the next slide. So nowadays, another concept that we have went over is related to the earlier discussions of communicative communicative competence and language ideology. So for many years, the language teaching often assumed that there was the native speaker English, and that was the main standard as well as the goal. However, the idea of native speaker, we used the acronym NS, native speaker, and non-native speaker as NNS before, but this dichotomy of NS and NNS is no longer being used because people have started to drift away, saying that there's no such thing as an ideal native speaker norm. And a lot of this assumption was being challenged by the World English scholars. So today, English is used globally by millions of multilingual speakers. Even in this classroom, English might not be your first language, but we use it for our communication. So in fact, many of these English conversations occur between people who are not native speakers at all. And this raises a very important question for AI because what type of accent should AI represent and which accents should learners hear? But I think also another one before we move on, like should AI always promote like American or British accent, or should AI expose learners to diverse Englishes? So this idea of World English's research emphasized that English exists in diverse global forms rather than a single native speaker standard. And these patterns reinforce linguistic hierarchies and shape learners' beliefs about legitimacy and intelligibility. This becomes quite important, not just because you might just say that, oh, well, it's fine which one becomes the legitimate variety of the language. What that would entail is that you would start looking at your language as illegitimate when one becomes legitimate. So that becomes the critical problem in understanding yourself as the speaker of the language. Let's say if only American or British English is considered to be the legitimate English variety, then in that case, all the rest of the varieties of speakers would consider themselves as suddenly these are non-native speakers. They do not have the ownership of the language English anymore. So that becomes a bit critical, and that's one of the reasons why people start talking about this linguistic hierarchy that seems to exist amongst language learners and language users. So researchers therefore examine how AI systems can better represent accent diversity and also promote more inclusive language ideologies. So if you remember going through the textbooks and so this is a study that I've done like 10 years ago, but if you look at the visa regulations to teach English in South Korea, you might be able to find that in order to obtain, I think it was like the E2 visa, you need to have the national citizenship coming from 7 countries, if I remember it correctly. And those 7 countries are only the inner circle countries that were mentioned from the cash rules version. So what that will also tell us is that, it seems to be very conservative in a way that we look as who is legitimate English speaker or English teacher to begin with. So it had a lot of issues related to it, and I thought that was very going against what we are going toward nowadays. But as such, if that's the reality that we face nowadays, if you go to 학원s, for example, and find only American or British English, but when you go outside over or even in this classroom, you're going to you meet people who use different type of accents. But if you're only trained with one variety, then it might limit your own awareness and your own development in understanding or communicating with others. So that brings out the problem that we currently have. But then AI could have that. I feel that AI could have that potential in introducing different varieties of languages, different varieties of English to learners. So learners can try out different varieties. So this is an experiment that I did last year or the year before where we trained AI speaking system the platforms to use multiple varieties. And it was quite interesting because when students were they could choose which variety that they want to talk with, whether it was the gender of the speaker, and then they would do the conversation. And it was quite interesting because when they talked with an Indian speaker, they usually talk about like curry or Indian products, you know. So it seems like we ourselves have our own understanding of the cultural background of these speakers, even though they might be just an Indian speakers of English living in the United States. Who knows, right? So we have those expectations, and that did come out during my experiment. But I feel like this is another area of interest where people can explore, especially related to AI speaking platforms. Other ideas related to that has to do with the translanguaging, the code switching that we looked at. So earlier theories often assumed that successful language learning required keeping languages somewhat separate, right? We talked about the default of how looking at the translanguaging or code switching was understood to be the deficit model, where it was showing the lack of knowledge in the learners. However, recent research, as you guys all have seen before, increasingly challenges that assumption, and translanguaging even recognizes that multilingual speakers draw on all of their linguistic resources when they are in conversation. So code switching was looking at switching between language A and B. Translanguaging is much broader. So looking at all these type of linguistic repertoire and also resources that students would bring into the classroom. So, for example, a Korean learner might ask, let's say, ChatGPT, how do I say this in English using Korean and English together? And so many learners could, in fact, use code switch and translate to compare languages and negotiate meanings across languages. And interestingly, AI seems to often support these practices very well nowadays. So the related to translation, I think translation is quite well developed nowadays. But this again would raise an important question. Things like, should language learning technologies encourage English-only interaction, or should they support multilingual communication? So there is, again, a growing evidence that strategic translanguaging can reduce anxiety and support learning, but we have to be very meticulous in how to design the learning of the use of translanguaging. So again, so we tried to, my student was trying to train AI with translanguaging, where the students can use translanguaging in communication and train the AI to understand in speaking discourse. And it was quite interesting because a lot of the cultural items that they did not really understand that well at that time, but it still seems to be functioning quite well enough. But I thought as a language educator that the most important part is whether AI can not whether AI can understand students' translanguaging and continue conversation. That is important, but that's not the only one. I feel like for language acquisition and language learning to happen, you have to be able to capture those moments where the translanguaging occurred and perhaps use those as materials for future learning. So that was just additional thought that I had. So now moving on to this might be one of the most fascinating areas of current research that I would have to say, where AI is not simply a tool. So many learners develop relationships with AI systems. I think not a couple, but long time ago now, I think there was the movie called Her. Have you guys seen it before? I think it was, no. Oh, so it was a movie about men falling in love with, or building relationship, falling in love with, and was it AI? Anel, do you remember? Or
Operating system. They called
operating
it
system?
OS. Yeah,
OS,
yeah,
yeah. So
yeah.
at that time, I don't think we used AI, the word itself, but so people, that movie was about building relationship and making relationship with the operating systems. So these type of systems. So when we ask the learners, some learners might describe AI differently. They might say that it's a tutor, they might say it's a coach, they might say it's a friend or a companion. You know, people might ask so many different questions, right, nowadays. And their use of it is, again, defining the identity of AI differently. So we are attaching different roles and expectations to AI depending on our use and our relationship with AI. So researchers have found that learners sometimes disclose personal thoughts to AI more easily than humans. In the data, which data that I think it was the speaking platform with the World Englishes one, or I forgot which one it was. So after we do the data, I collect everything because I do qualitative research. I looked at all the discourse interaction. And I was very surprised because there was one student who said to the AI that I want to rest in peace. So initially when I saw that, I was like so shocked. I was like, oh. And one thought that I had was maybe the student was trying to was not really good in English, that he or she literally meant, I just want to take some rest in a peaceful manner. So I went through the next step, and then it was actually, I went to the next turn, and it was in fact a serious case where the student really was experiencing emotional breakdown. So I looked at how AI responded to that, and the AI, because we designed it for AI speaking, English speaking. So it was like it was like, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. So let's talk about English again. So I was like, oh no, like, of course it was designed for that purpose, but the student, I could say that the student was trying to explain or trying to disclose much more of that personal feelings that the student probably had trouble doing it with another human being. Of course, I'm glad that the AI did not intervene and started providing all these psychological advice, because I think that would also be very dangerous. But what I thought was, when we find those moments where students could in fact open up, we might at least alarm let's say the parents, or if it's like a junior high school student, for example, or tell the teacher, for example, or point to where the student could get additional help. But as you can see, these encounters do happen, that the users of the users of AI would be able to build like different relationships than just teacher learner, or the student, the tutor or the learner. It could be much more than that, and that could both pose problems, but also it could also provide a lot of strength to the system as well. So we can in fact use that. But other thing is that we might try to answer the question, like, why might this happen? So perhaps because AI feels less judgmental, or as we just talked about, or AI is always available, or perhaps learners feel greater control in their talk. Or so it all goes back with our concepts of identity and agency. So throughout the semester, we've discussed how language learning is not only about grammar, right? It is also about who we are, how we see ourselves, how we represent ourselves, and how we present ourselves to others, and also how we see other people. So all these would be something that we should consider when we are trying to design or at least approach these AI systems, as AI is going to become part of those processes. So this is the one that Chongsu talked about, like multimodality, and also multimodal interaction and assessment. So communication is much more than words, right? So this, think back to our discussions of kinesics, for example, gestures, eye contact, facial expressions, and the discourse itself. So when humans communicate with other human beings, we use multiple modes simultaneously at the same time. And this was called multimodality. And now researchers are asking things like, can AI assess or evaluate communication beyond grammar and vocabulary? So could AI examine eye contact? Like, for example, in English presentation class, when you're doing a presentation, can it really measure the eye contact that it's making, the gestures, the turn taking, the interactional competence that we talked about, or even engagement? Can we evaluate that? And this creates very exciting possibilities of AI, but at the same time, it also raises concerns. So how accurate? We talked about cultural backgrounds, for example, but how accurate are these interpretations? Or should machines evaluate human behaviors in that such detail? So these questions are likely to shape our future directions of research in the field of, especially in the areas of multimodal interaction. So going to research methods and calls. So in computer-assisted language learning research, as future researcher, it's important to understand how it is conducted. So researchers use many methods nowadays. So they do a lot of experiments, they can conduct surveys, they can do interviews, do discourse analysis on the interviews or the data that they have, conversation analysis, or multimodal analysis. So notice how these methods connect to topics that we have discussed throughout the semester. And researchers often collect these data, such as interaction logs, screen recordings, interviews, learner reflections, and AI-generated transcripts. Mixed methods approach are also used when we are combining multiple sources, multiple data, because they allow researchers to examine both measurable learning outcomes as well as the learner experiences. No, we can't really necessarily say that only measurable learning outcomes are best or only learner experiences are best. They both have their own strengths and weaknesses. It's just depending on how we want to complement one another and use that in research. In addition to that, we have the ethical considerations, including the consent, privacy, and data security that are increasingly, of course, becoming very important. This was one of the challenges that AI digital textbooks experienced, because they talked about the privacy issues, that the student data is going to become available. And one of the things that I remember at that time was that the Korean government decided that they're not going to allow AI digital textbooks to use ChatGPT or any of the AI companies outside Korea, because they were afraid of the leakage of the data and also the private information, and the other nations would be able to find out the level of English proficiency of our students. So they decided they initially said that they were only going to advise AI digital textbooks to only use Korean companies. But you can imagine, that was like 2 years ago, or a year ago. So it was like, there wasn't a strong AI company to really back it up at that point. So that was, I think, one of the reasons why AI digital textbooks were not welcomed at that time. I think it was just too soon, too fast. Anyways, so as we continue on, so I think this is some sort of a conclusion of this semester. I'd like us to think about the future. We have started from the past and we are moving towards the future, and AI is in the middle of that, where it is in fact adding the speed to the evolution very rapidly too. So we now see conversational AI. We are going to soon see multimodal AI. We see personalized learning systems, the agentic AI. Then the more important question that we can ask ourselves is not just what can AI do anymore. The more important question, especially in the field of language learning, is what kind of language learning future do we want to create? Since we are at the stage of still development, and also we said that technology is never neutral. Every technological decisions that we make is going to reflect the educational values. And that was one of the reasons why last time when we looked at Duolingo, I asked some of you guys to look at who created it and what kind of background did that person have. And it would be best, or it would be most effective when this type of technology is introduced with the values that come from it. So we have to ask more of the important questions like, do we want personalization? Do we want more automation? Or do we want more inclusivity or more human interaction? As future, I think some of you might become educators, or some of you might become researchers, or we are all going to be still language users. You are all going to help answer these questions, and the future of the computer assisted language learning, I believe, is not just about technology. It's about people, communication, learning, identity, and society. So I think overall throughout the semester, as I mentioned at the very beginning of the class, this class was not just going to be about how to learn language most effectively for yourself, but it's much more about the humans' use of language and the society. So I'd like to end with a short reflection. And at the beginning of the semester, many people thought that language learning was primarily about grammar and vocabulary, right? And over the past few weeks, we have explored something that was much broader, that language learning involves communication, culture, identity, and such, and technology, and also the increasingly AI nowadays. So my hope is that you leave this course not simply knowing more theories, because I mean, it is important, but not simply of that, but asking better questions about language education and also technology, since we are at KAIST. So thank you all very much for your participation in this semester. I was so pleased to have you all in this class. I wish you all the best in your future studies or research or in careers. And if you have in the future too, if you just have some of the lingering thoughts in your mind related, or if you have any other thoughts or questions that you want to bring back to us, let me just stop the screen so that I see you guys. Then please feel free to contact me. And I think thank you all for the wonderful semester.